Here we've got the new ATEM Television Studio HD8 ISO, and here we have the ATEM SDI Extreme ISO. Well, actually this is the HDMI version, but they're nearly identical other than the SDI ports. These may look quite different at first, and at $4,000 versus $1,500, you would expect them to be wildly different, but they're actually a lot more similar than you'd think. Hi, I'm Aaron Parecki. The Television Studio HD8 in front of me is on loan from Blackmagic, but they're not paying me to make this video and they don't get any control over the content of this video. I actually bought my first ATEM switcher almost 10 years ago, and I've bought a ton of different models over the years since. Everything from the $300 ATEM Mini to the $3,700 ATEM 4ME Constellation HD that I'm using in my studio now. The Extreme SDI and the HD8 sit somewhere in between those two, at least in terms of functionality. Now, I'm not going to go over all the details of both models since I already have other videos that cover those. This video covers all the ATEM SDI models, and this video covers the new features in the Television Studio HD8. But the reason we're even talking about these two side by side is because they are both 8-input switchers, and actually have a lot of similar functionality. So let's get into the main differences between the Extreme SDI and the Television Studio HD8. Obviously, the biggest difference is the panel. The panel is like the software control app in real life. Now, one thing to keep in mind with all this is that Blackmagic actually sells an ATEM control panel by itself for about $3,000. That panel is a giant fancy controller, but it doesn't do any video switching on its own. You can use it with any ATEM, even an ATEM Mini if you really wanted to. So when you think about the cost difference between the ATEM 1ME Advanced panel versus the Television Studio HD8, which is only $1,000 more, Television Studio is actually a great deal. But the HD8 compared to the ATEM Mini Extreme is quite the price difference. $4,000 versus $1,500, even though they are both 8-input switchers. But the panel on the HD8 is just gorgeous, and it makes the ATEM Mini Extreme feel like just a toy. Is that worth $3,500 to you? Maybe. But there are also a couple more advanced features of the HD8 that we'll get into later in this video. And aside from the panel being just really nice to use and look at, the biggest difference functionality-wise is that you can actually change almost every setting in the ATEM from the panel itself. With the ATEM Mini Extreme, you're going to have to get out a computer to change most of the settings, other than the simple camera switching and simple presets you get from the buttons. Next, I want to talk about outputs. And this is something where the Extreme SDI actually has an advantage. On the HD8, there are 2 aux outputs, but the SDI Extreme has 4. So why is this important? Well, aux outputs are outputs where you can choose what to send out of them. So they're super flexible. On the larger broadcast style ATEMs, there is usually a dedicated port for multi-view and program and preview outputs. And this makes sense if you're installing it in a large studio where you'll have a bunch of monitors you can use for each of those functions. And then separate from those dedicated outputs, there will be 1 or more aux outputs on the switcher as well. And those are actually completely assignable. So in a studio, you might use this to be able to quickly see a large version of one of your cameras, or you could send a copy of the computer screen back to a conference monitor on stage for your talent, or you could even feed a projector in a room. Now, the aux outputs are not quite the same as having a whole separate ME like you get with the 2ME or 4ME, but it's still super useful for all sorts of things. Now, on the ATEM Mini line, they went with a different approach. Instead of giving you a dedicated multi-view and program outputs, they have only an aux output. So you can switch it between multi-view and program or anything else depending on how you're using it. And this is where the different ATEM Mini models have different combinations of these. The ATEM Mini Pro has 1 aux output. The ATEM SDI has 2. The ATEM Mini Extreme has 2, and the ATEM SDI Extreme has 4. So if you have the ATEM SDI Extreme with the 4 aux outs, you can use 1 for multi-view, 1 for program, and then have 2 left over for other things like a conference monitor and a projector. But sometimes you don't actually need a whole dedicated output for the program out. Like if you're recording to a drive and streaming online, you can probably get away with watching the program out of the multi-view port. And that just means you can use the 3rd aux out for something else. And you don't get that flexibility with the Television Studio HD8. The HD8 has dedicated outputs for the multi-view and program and only 2 aux outputs. I do wish they would have added a few more aux outputs on the HD8 since 2 is somewhat limiting. One of the coolest features of the ISO model of the Television Studio HD8 is the built-in streaming receivers. You can create stream keys inside of the ATEM, and then you can choose whether each of your 8 inputs will be an SDI input or a remote stream input. Once you change the inputs into remote inputs, you can stream to the ATEM from any of the Blackmagic products. That includes the Blackmagic Studio cameras with the streaming feature, a web presenter, and even an ATEM Mini. If you stream from a camera, then the tally light and even the camera control is sent back up from the ATEM to the camera. So it's basically an entirely remote workflow. You can connect the camera to an internet connection like tethering it via USB to a phone, and it's an entirely remotely operated camera that works just the same as if it were in the studio with you. I'll leave a link down below to another video where I walk through the step-by-step of how to configure the camera for live streaming into the ATEM. Now you can of course do this kind of remote streaming into a streaming bridge as well. And that's a separate box that's dedicated to just receiving the stream from an ATEM Mini or a web presenter or a camera. But with a television studio, it's kind of like having 8 streaming bridges all built into this box. So those are the 3 biggest differences between the Television Studio HD8 and the ATEM Mini Extreme SDI. There are quite a lot of other features of the HD8 as well, but I'll save that for a different video. Do keep in mind that the streaming features I mentioned are only in the ISO version of the Television Studio, not the base model. And while the HD8 is certainly a very nice device with a lot of amazing features, you actually get a lot of the same functionality, at least in terms of video switching and layout capability, in the much cheaper ATEM Extreme SDI ISO. So I hope this video has been helpful. Please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.